The events that took place in Toronto, Canada in 2022 shocked the local community and became one of the most discussed topics in the news. What initially seemed like a tragic affair turned into a chilling chain of events that ended in a crime, affecting the lives of many. It all began as a secret romance, but gradually transformed into something no one could have imagined. A woman named Catherine Rivers worked as an English teacher at Lester Pearson High School in a quiet neighborhood of Toronto. She was a respected figure among colleagues and parents, demonstrating deep dedication to her work and being considered an excellent educator. No one could have imagined that behind the facade of an exemplary teacher lay something dark and dangerous. Only a few knew that Catherine led a double life, and even fewer knew where it would lead. Her involvement with a student began with innocent conversations after classes, when Catherine took an interest in one of her students, 17-year-old Mark Henderson. Mark was a typical teenager, modest, quiet, but with expressive eyes full of depth. He was an excellent student, interested in literature, and his intellectual nature captivated Catherine. This led their after-class conversations to evolve into long walks and then into secret meetings, where not only feelings blossomed, but also dangerous attraction. Catherine found herself drawn deeper into this relationship, which was entirely inappropriate and, even worse, increasingly uncontrollable. She could no longer control her emotions, and her obsession with Mark grew with each passing day, until she could not imagine her life without him. However, their secret relationship began to spark suspicion. Catherine's students and colleagues noticed their interactions and began to wonder what was really happening between the teacher and the student. The first rumors spread quickly, drawing Mark's attention as well. Mark found himself trapped by his own feelings and fears. He was flattered by Catherine's attention, but knew it was wrong. Gradually, the relationship began to cause him anxiety. He realized that it could ruin his future and began avoiding the teacher. However, Catherine could not let that happen. She became increasingly intrusive, and her control over Mark intensified. She threatened that if he broke off the relationship, she would reveal their secret, ruining his reputation and leaving him no choice but to leave school. Things reached a critical point in early October 2022, when Mark realized his life was becoming unbearable. He began discussing his problems with friends, trying to find a way out. One of his friends even suggested telling his parents or going to the school counselor for support. But the fear of consequences was so great that Mark remained hesitant. Catherine learned of his plans and began acting with a cruelty that caught him off guard. Not only did she keep track of his movements, but she also came to his house, forcing him to hide her visits from his parents. One of the neighbors once saw Catherine standing outside Mark's window late at night, which looked extremely suspicious. No one could understand why a respected teacher was behaving so strangely. Each day, her obsession scared Mark more and more. The breaking point came on October 15th when Mark disappeared. His parents raised the alarm when he didn't return home from school. The police began an investigation, starting by questioning Mark's friends and teachers to learn more about his last days. Some friends spoke of the strange relationship between Mark and his teacher Rivers, and this became a key lead in the case. Catherine was brought in for questioning but denied all accusations. She claimed that she had never had anything but professional interest in her student, and that the rumors were likely just teenage gossip. However, investigators were not ready to stop there. They began checking her connections and reviewing surveillance footage, which eventually confirmed that Catherine often met Mark outside of school. The situation became even more suspicious when the police found messages on Catherine's phone containing threats directed at Mark. She had threatened him with harm if he decided to end their relationship. The complexity of the situation was compounded by Catherine's intelligence and careful planning, but her obsession had overpowered her reason, leading her to make a fatal mistake. On October 17th, the police received a tip from a witness who had seen Catherine and Mark enter an abandoned building on the outskirts of Toronto. This witness, concerned, decided to report it to the authorities, knowing about the boys' disappearance. Officers immediately went to the scene and found an abandoned house. Inside, they discovered Mark. He was dead. Mark's body lay on the floor of a dirty room, his hands tied, with signs of injuries on his face. The coroner later determined that the cause of death was asphyxiation. Evidence pointing to Catherine's presence was found at the scene. Her fingerprints and personal belongings, including a bag with school materials she used in class. Investigators realized this was not an accidental crime, but a premeditated act triggered by a loss of control over the situation. Catherine was immediately arrested by the police, initially trying to deny her involvement. She claimed that she had been at the crime scene but left before anything happened. Nevertheless, all evidence pointed to her, and she was soon charged with first-degree crime. Investigators began reconstructing the sequence of events, and the more they learned, the more shocking the story became. Catherine had planned the crime when she realized she would lose Mark. Her obsession was so overwhelming that she decided that if he couldn't be with her, he wouldn't be with anyone. The public was horrified by what had happened. The story of the teacher-student relationship that ended in a violent crime shocked everyone who knew Catherine and Mark. Mark's parents were devastated. They couldn't believe their son had become a victim of such a terrible act. At the school where Catherine worked, inspections were initiated to ensure that similar incidents would not happen again. Students and teachers were scared and couldn't believe that someone they knew and respected could be capable of such a thing. Investigators continued gathering evidence to ensure they had enough for a trial. They studied every detail of Catherine's life, trying to understand what had led her so deeply into her own illusions and caused her to lose touch with reality. Gradually, her mental health problems came to light, as well as diary entries clearly showing her intense obsession with Mark. The story became a topic of discussion not only in Toronto, but across Canada. The media covered every aspect of the case, trying to understand how such a situation could arise. Issues of student safety, teacher behavior monitoring, and ways to prevent such incidents in the future were discussed. Psychology experts suggested that Catherine likely suffered from a mental disorder, which ultimately led to her aggressive actions and crime. Catherine Rivers faced trial, where the prosecution presented substantial evidence of her guilt. Witnesses, including Mark's friends, teachers, and even his parents, testified against her. Catherine's mental state was a subject of discussion throughout the trial. Her defense attorneys tried to convince the court that she was unaware of her actions and that her behavior was driven by mental illness. However, enough evidence was presented to prove the intentional nature of her actions. This story, full of horror and tragedy, left a deep mark on everyone involved. It became a grim reminder of what obsessive and unhealthy relationships can lead to, especially when one person holds power over another. As Mark's parents tried to cope with the pain of losing their son, the public demanded justice and punishment for the teacher who had turned their lives into a nightmare. While Catherine Rivers remained in custody, tension in Toronto continued to rise. The fear sparked by this story led parents, students, and even teachers to reconsider their attitudes toward safety and trust in the school. The second phase of the investigation brought even more intrigue and unexpected discoveries, revealing a dark web of manipulation and deception. After Catherine's arrest, the police conducted a second search of her home. Among her belongings, they found several suspicious items: photos of Mark, his schoolwork, and even his personal items that somehow ended up with Catherine. Among all this were diaries full of detailed records of her interactions with Mark. These diaries were a real revelation for investigators. They revealed her obsession with the teenager, her fixation on controlling every aspect of his life, and her intense jealousy of anyone who could distance Mark from her. Investigators also discovered that Catherine used social media and email to monitor Mark. She installed special software on his phone that allowed her to track his movements and read his private messages. This information helped create a detailed portrait of a manipulator willing to do anything to maintain control over her student. The level of her preparation and thoroughness was frightening, and it soon became clear that she didn't just want to keep Mark. She saw him as her property. Besides the diaries, hidden video recordings were found that Catherine had secretly made. The footage showed Mark at different moments of his life, during school classes, on walks with friends, and even at home. These recordings left no doubt that Catherine went as far as violating Mark's privacy, with no regard for the consequences. These video materials served as further evidence against her and supported the investigation's theory of her complete control and obsession. Meanwhile, tensions were escalating at Lester Pearson High School. Teachers were shocked that one of their colleagues could be capable of such actions. Parents demanded explanations from the school administration as to how this could have happened and why no one noticed Catherine's strange behavior earlier. The school administration had to take steps to restore trust by implementing additional procedures for monitoring teachers and their interactions with students. One of the key pieces of evidence in the investigation was a letter that Mark wrote shortly before his disappearance. The letter was addressed to his best friend, and in it, he openly expressed fear of Catherine. He described how she would come to his house, follow him, and threaten him. Mark admitted that he was afraid to tell adults about it, as Catherine had threatened to ruin his reputation and even harm his family. This letter became crucial evidence that showed Mark was trying to find a way out, but was too scared to ask for help. The trial became a real ordeal for everyone involved in the case. Not only Mark's parents and friends, but also numerous members of the public and media attended the hearings, carefully following the process. The prosecution built its case on the fact that Catherine deliberately manipulated the teenager, using her authority and position, and that her actions were premeditated. The defense attorneys, on the other hand, argued that Catherine suffered from a mental disorder and didn't realize her behavior was crossing the line. During one of the court sessions, the results of Catherine's psychological evaluation were presented. Experts concluded that she did indeed suffer from a severe mental disorder, but that did not absolve her of responsibility for her actions. The evaluation confirmed that Catherine was fully competent at the time of the crime and understood what she was doing. Her obsession with controlling Mark and fear of losing him were the driving forces that led her to commit the crime. The testimonies of Mark's friends and teachers also played an important role in the case. They described how Mark gradually changed, becoming more withdrawn and anxious. One of Mark's friends said that in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Mark was very tense and afraid to go out alone. Teachers also noticed Catherine's unusual behavior. She would stay after class to talk to Mark, and often showed excessive concern for him, which went beyond ordinary teacher conduct. One of the most intriguing moments in the investigation occurred when the police received an anonymous tip from someone who claimed to have seen Catherine giving money to an unknown man shortly before Mark's disappearance. Investigators found out that Catherine had hired a private investigator to follow Mark when she couldn't do it herself. This fact further highlighted her obsession and willingness to go to any lengths to control the teenager. The detective hired by Catherine later testified in court, stating that he was unaware of her intentions and that it seemed strange to him that a teacher was so involved in her student's life. The public followed the case with bated breath. People couldn't believe that such a respected teacher could commit such a terrible crime. The media covered every step of the investigation and each day of the trial, and the story grew darker. Discussions emerged about the need for reforms in the education system to prevent such cases. Parents demanded increased oversight of teachers and the introduction of psychological testing for those working with children. With each day of the trial, the picture became clearer. The prosecution presented Catherine's correspondence with Mark, in which she threatened him if he tried to end their relationship. She wrote that if he left her, she would destroy his life. These messages were full of threats and manipulation, proving her willingness to do anything to keep the teenager by her side. The second chapter of this case ended with Catherine being found guilty of first-degree crime. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Mark's parents, this sentence was a small victory, but they knew that nothing would bring their son back. The public, shaken by the story, realized how important it is to pay attention to signs of unhealthy relationships and intervene before it's too late. The story of Catherine Rivers and Mark Henderson became one of the darkest examples of what abuse of power and obsession can lead to. It served as a reminder that teachers, entrusted with the lives and well-being of children, bear enormous responsibility for their actions. Society must remain vigilant and ready to step in to protect those who cannot protect themselves. After Catherine Rivers was arrested, the investigation took a new turn. The police and attorneys continued gathering facts, and in the process, new details emerged that allowed them to take a fresh look at the entire incident. It turned out that the situation was far more complex than initially thought, and behind the obvious line of crime lay multiple layers of intrigue and manipulation. During a reanalysis of the data, investigators noticed several suspicious phone conversations that had not previously been considered relevant. These calls were made by Catherine at night, and their geolocation pointed to various areas of the city, including abandoned buildings and empty parking lots. Upon closer examination, it was established that Catherine was meeting with someone who was helping her organize surveillance of Mark. This connection was not obvious until the police gained access to the recordings of these calls. Investigators began analyzing individuals who could be involved in the case and soon tracked down one of Catherine's former colleagues, a man named Paul Sanders. Paul had worked with Catherine at the school a few years ago, and apparently they had remained in contact. Paul's neighbors confirmed seeing Catherine near his house on the days when Mark disappeared. Paul was detained and questioned, and although he initially denied involvement, investigators found surveillance equipment in his garage: cameras, microphones, and GPS trackers. These devices were used to monitor Mark. Paul's testimony led to an unexpected twist in the case. He explained that Catherine convinced him to help her by telling a story about how Mark was allegedly involved in dangerous activities and that she was trying to protect him. Paul believed her and agreed to install the equipment to monitor the teenager. According to him, Catherine was very convincing and even showed fake documents that supposedly supported her claims. This testimony revealed how meticulously Catherine planned her crime and how she used others to achieve her goals. During the investigation, it also became known that Catherine forged school reports to control Mark's academic performance. She altered his grades and even sent false notifications to his parents, convincing them that Mark was struggling with his studies and needed her support. This allowed her to stay close to him and create the impression that her role in his life was purely educational and caring. However, Mark's parents began to notice that their son was becoming more withdrawn and depressed, and their trust in Catherine started to wane. Another intriguing discovery was the presence of a secret diary that Catherine kept hidden in her home. In this diary, she not only recorded her feelings for Mark, but also details of her plan, including attempts to find compromising information on his friends and family. She hoped that by threatening Mark with the exposure of this information, she could keep him close. These records were shocking evidence of her willingness to manipulate and abuse trust, as well as her complete obsession with controlling the teenager's life. Meanwhile, investigators discovered that Catherine also used fake social media accounts to spy on Mark and his circle. She created false profiles to gain the trust of his friends and gather information about Mark's every move. These accounts allowed her to know whom he was interacting with, where he was going, and even what he planned to do next. This knowledge gave her the opportunity to interfere with his plans and control his social life, severing his ties with those around him. Investigators also found that Catherine not only monitored Mark, but actively interfered in his personal life. She sent anonymous messages to his friends to sow distrust among them, and even arranged fake meetings that were supposed to lead to his social isolation. In one such case, she sent a message to Mark's best friend, pretending to be Mark, and arranging a meeting at a place where Mark would never go. This caused a conflict between the teenagers, and as a result, Mark lost the support of a close friend at a critical moment. The most unexpected discovery was that Catherine was planning to flee the country with Mark. On her computer, investigators found plane tickets to Europe and forged documents that were meant to help them disappear. She planned to take him to a place where no one could find them and where she could continue controlling his life. These documents, along with correspondence with unidentified individuals who were supposed to assist her in this plan, became crucial pieces of evidence proving that her intentions were far more dangerous than just surveillance and manipulation. These new facts came as a real shock to Mark's parents and the entire community. People could not believe that a teacher, whom they had trusted with their children, was capable of such cruel and calculated actions. The media covered every step of the investigation, and psychology experts tried to explain what could have driven Catherine to such levels of obsession. Schools in Toronto began introducing additional safety measures to protect students from potentially dangerous behavior by adults entrusted with their care. Mark's parents actively advocated for reforms in the education system and the creation of programs for early detection of such cases. They demanded mandatory psychological assessments for teachers and the establishment of hotlines where students could seek help if they felt pressure or threats. Their goal was to ensure that no other child would find themselves in a similar situation and that such tragedies would never happen again. The start of Catherine Rivers' trial drew enormous public and media attention. The revelations made during the investigation had shocked Toronto and sparked outrage among parents and educators. People were waiting for a just punishment for the teacher who, using her authority and trust, committed a series of harmful actions aimed at controlling a teenager. This process was not only about punishment for Catherine, but also a warning to anyone who might abuse their position in the future. The court hearings began with witness testimonies. One of the first to take the stand was Paul Sanders, Catherine's former colleague who had unknowingly assisted her in surveilling Mark. Paul claimed that he had been deceived, as Catherine presented him with fake documents, and stated that Mark was involved in dangerous activities that required intervention. Paul admitted his guilt, but also tried to convey to the court that he had been misled. He expressed regret for trusting Catherine and becoming involved in her criminal activities. Next, Mark's parents took the stand. Their testimonies became one of the most emotional moments of the trial. Mark's mother, Linda Henderson, struggled to hold back tears as she described how her son became more withdrawn, lost friends, and fell into depression. She spoke of those troubling times when Mark refused to talk to his parents and avoided seeing friends. Her words touched everyone present, highlighting the severe psychological damage Catherine had inflicted on their son and their entire family. The prosecution presented numerous pieces of evidence of Catherine's guilt, including text messages, video recordings, and diaries she kept. Particular attention was given to her plan to flee the country with Mark. The found tickets and fake documents were key pieces of evidence, showing that her actions were not impulsive, but instead represented a carefully planned crime. The prosecutor described Catherine as a cold-blooded manipulator, who would stop at nothing to achieve her goal. The defense attorneys tried to build their case on the argument that Catherine suffered from a mental disorder. They suggested that her actions were driven by emotional instability and a pathological attachment to Mark, which had turned into an obsession. The defense tried to convince the court that Catherine needed treatment rather than punishment, but the experts who conducted the psychological evaluation stated that Catherine was fully competent at the time of the crime and fully understood her actions. They noted that her planning and systematic stalking could not solely be the result of a mental disorder. Throughout the entire trial, Catherine showed no signs of remorse. She claimed that her actions were intended to protect Mark, and that she did it out of love for him. However, her statements only caused more outrage among parents, educators, and the public. Many viewed her behavior in court as additional evidence of her inability to comprehend the gravity of her actions and the harm she had caused. After several weeks of hearings, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The jury went to deliberate. A few hours later, they returned with a verdict. Catherine Rivers was found guilty on all charges, including unlawful invasion of privacy, financial manipulation, threats, and abduction. The judge, taking into account all the presented evidence and testimonies, sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This sentence was the maximum penalty that could be given in this case. The court's decision was met with approval by those present. Mark's parents finally felt that justice had been served, although they knew that nothing would return their son to his former life. The public, who had followed the case, viewed the verdict as an important step toward protecting children from abuse by adults they trust. The media covered the trial as an example of how crucial it is to notice signs of abuse of power in time and intervene before the situation gets out of control. Schools in Toronto began actively implementing new programs aimed at teaching teachers and students safe communication rules and identifying potential signs of manipulation and pressure. After the verdict, significant changes took place in Canada's educational system. Mandatory psychological resilience testing was introduced for all teachers, along with additional courses on ethics and behavior in interactions with students. Parents were given more opportunities to engage with educational institutions, including regular meetings with teachers and administrators to discuss issues of children's safety and well-being. Mark's parents became active participants in public initiatives aimed at preventing similar cases. They created a foundation dedicated to helping children affected by abuse and manipulation. Linda and her husband John often spoke at public events, sharing their story and emphasizing how important it is to pay attention to changes in children's behavior, even if they seem minor. They wanted their tragic experience to serve as a lesson for everyone, and to ensure that no other child would end up in a similar situation. The story of Catherine Rivers and Mark Henderson became one of the most high-profile cases in the history of the Canadian education system. It showed how dangerous the abuse of trust and power could be, and how important it is to create conditions where such cases are impossible. This case served as a reminder to everyone working with children of the responsibility they bear, and that even the slightest signs of misconduct must be noticed and addressed.